Hello and welcome. You're watching Focus on, and I'm Kenneth Igbomo. Africa is on the front line of a climate emergency, and the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program is the continent's response to the impact of the climate crisis. The program is built around 4 pillars, from food security, resilient infrastructure, youth entrepreneurship and green jobs, and innovative climate adaptation finance for Africa. The Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank are currently mobilizing $25 billion by the year 2025 to accelerate adaptation in Africa. The African Development Bank has already committed $12.5 billion of its own capital, which is half of the funding required at the launch of the program. At the Africa Adaptation Summit in Rotterdam, President of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, says that he wants global partners to meet Africa halfway.
You know, here we are in Rotterdam. We're all discussing about climate change. But the critical thing on climate change for us in Africa is climate adaptation. Africa loses about between $7 to $15 billion a year as a result of climate change. If we don't change anything on that, it's going to rise to $50 billion a year by 2030. And that's money Africa doesn't have. So when we had the Conference of Parties, the COP26 in Glasgow, what was agreed? It was agreed that the developed countries were going to meet their commitment, which was to provide $100 billion a year for developing countries to adapt to climate change, for climate finance, and that they will double the amount of resources actually available for climate adaptation. Now, in the case of Africa, we did not cause climate change. We only account for 3% of all the emissions in the world. But we are suffering disproportionately from the negative consequences of it. Today, Africa loses between $7 and $15 billion a year as a result of climate change, droughts, flood. Then you have to repair infrastructure because you have floods and all of those kind of things. You have displaced populations that are affected as a result of, they can't find water. Girls are dropping out of school, just because they can't find water. As you know, girls in many rural areas are the ones that go look for water. And this is affecting us significantly, right? And then if we don't change that, that will rise to $50 billion a year. And therefore, it's very important now that the developed countries meet their obligations. Words are not enough. Encouragement, it's not enough. What matters are resources. I tell you how serious this is. You take the case of East Africa. In the last 2 years, there has been no rains all across East Africa. Significant amount of drought, affecting the livestock. The hardest, the pastoralists there, losing all their livestock in large quantities. Farmers can't grow, or they are losing their crops massively because of lack of that. And the resources aren't there to provide them with insurance to insure themselves against all of this risk. So basically what I'm saying is that on adaptation for Africa, the plane took off in Glasgow at COP26. That plane has to land in terms of financial commitments in COP27, which will be the Africa COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And so all we're trying to do right now is to make sure that the resources, by the time we land in Sharm el-Sheikh, are actually there to support Africa to adapt to climate change.
Yeah, because now it's good to see that showing from African leaders here today, and even the African voice, if I put it that way, from players like yourself, from sitting presidents. And I spoke to the IMF head today, and she was like, African leaders need to speak, and so that the world can hear their voice. More or less, I'd like to speak to, yes, because this is not a one-party fight. Everybody needs to come together. We need concerted efforts to help this, because this is the common problem. But then we're getting a strong showing from Africa. We're getting a strong showing from the development finance community. But then some players are missing here today. Private sector players not as represented as much as we would like, and some of the players from other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, for us, at the African Development Bank, everything can change. There are variables can be all over the place that can affect how much resources will be available, when it will be available, and also, or whatever. What I can tell you is what we are doing ourselves, because I'm not waiting, right? I can't tell countries that we don't have resources. That's why we at the African Development Bank, when we launched the African Adaptation Acceleration Program together with the Global Center on Adaptation, to raise $25 billion for climate adaptation in Africa. We actually, at the African Development Bank, put down half of that, $12.5 billion of it. So what we are asking the rest of the developed countries to do is to meet up halfway, right? If you look at how much financing actually Africa needs to actually adapt in terms of climate financing gap, it averages about $125 billion between 2020 and 2030. So even the $25 billion we're talking about is still very small compared to what the needs of Africa really are. And so, but I expect if we cannot deliver on the $12.5 billion, how in the world are we going to deliver on $125 billion? And so really, I think it needs political commitment. But more than political commitment, that political commitment has to be translated into financing for Africa. Financing to provide access to climate resilient seeds, for farmers, whether it's maize, whether it's rice or cassava or other crops, or wheat, for example, all across. Climate finance to be able to support farmers to insure themselves against extreme weather patterns. Climate insurance to be able to support countries to also insure themselves against extreme weather disasters. So without this kind of facilities, market risk transfer mechanisms to support countries, they just cannot cope. And so as a result of that, my own view is that as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh, everybody has to play their role. The leaders of the developed countries have to come to the table and meet their obligation. Remember, it is their obligation to meet the $100 billion a year promised. And when Africa and all the developing countries went to Paris Agreement and they signed the nationally determined contributions, that is what they will do to reduce the emissions, but also ensure that they can go towards net zero emissions. All of those things they signed were conditional. 80% of them were conditional on this $100 billion a year being available. So if it's not there, even the success of the Paris Agreement is totally at risk. If we don't succeed in Africa, we cannot succeed globally.
Yeah, because the voices are needed, and everybody needs to play their part put their part on the table. And I like.
I'm not sure, if I might just cover that, I'm not sure that at this point it's voices that are needed. It's finance that is needed. The voices are here, the needs are there, the programs are there. It's not talking more. So it's putting the money there on the table and getting the job done. That's all that matters.
And it's great to see that there's already a plan in place on how this is going to be leveraged, and that's what I'd like to get into next. More or less looking at the AAAP, more or less its merits and how it plans to uniquely address the challenges Africa is facing. And I'd like to speak to that and more or less give me some more insight about the downstream facility which is housing the AfDB.
When we set up this facility at the African Development Bank, it's supposed to look at maybe four things. First is to support farmers globally to have access to climate information. So those in rural areas to have a lot of access to climate information. So supporting hydrometeorological services that can provide them real-time weather services. And we're trying to reach 30 million farmers with climate information services that will allow them to be able to know this is when it's going to rain, this is when you're going to have drought, then change your crop to this, or whatever you have to do, or water harvesting and so on. That's one big part of what we're trying to do. The other thing that we're trying to do is to also to build resilience into our infrastructure. Because when you look at the case of Cyclone Idai that hit Mozambique, that hit Malawi, and also hit Zimbabwe, they lost roughly about $2.5 billion in terms of infrastructure. Well, that's money they have to find to repair infrastructure for which they already have deficits to start with. And so what we're trying to do now is to make sure that within this downstream facility, we support countries to climate-proof, if you wish, their infrastructure, making sure that they are climate resilient, in terms of if you have floods and things like that. So it's a big component of what we are doing. The third part is this. All those that created all the emissions since 1805 with the Industrial Revolution, they are long gone. And the developed countries that did it are still prospering. But those that are negatively affected the most in Africa are Africa's youth. They did not cause climate change, but their lives are going to get terribly affected by it because the incomes of their country will be low. They cannot create jobs. They're going to be subject to all these shocks, to their lives. They may even have displaced populations all over Africa in many cases. Now we have about 4.6 million people that are displaced. That creates fragility, weakens the economy. And so within this downstream facility, we are working to support 1 million businesses of young people to be able to get into the green economy and how they can do climate resilience in Africa. Then the fourth part of the facility is to actually mobilize more climate finance itself through innovative financing. We need roughly an average to raise about $125 billion a year. But it's not going to be possible to do all that from the public sector, no way. Yeah, because of debt overhangs and all of that. So the private sector, therefore, will play a very big role. And so one of the ways in which we are trying to do that is, we've launched something called the African Financial Alliance for Climate at the African Development Bank. We're working with the Global Center on Adaptation and others. And it essentially brings together the central banks all across Africa, the commercial banks. It brings together the stock exchanges all across Africa, the sovereign wealth funds, and also the other institutional investors and insurance companies. Essentially, if you think about it, if we need to raise $105 billion a year, right, we can raise that if we tilt the economy in Africa to become on a trajectory of green growth. And that's why if you think, for example, take the example of stock exchanges, if you're valuing your companies based on the greenness of their businesses, then the valuation of those companies change because they are green, and you're able to crowd in a lot of green financing into that. And so all those, you're talking about maybe about $1.8 trillion so far on those commodity exchanges, then or stock exchanges. So it means that therefore you can green the economy and be able to generate a lot more resources.
And take advantage of the capital markets as well.
Capital markets than you can just from public financing. So these are the elements that we are doing. But in addition to that, we have something else at the African Development Bank we're doing, which is called we have a fund which is called the African Development Fund. The African Development Fund is the concessional arm of the bank that supports low-income countries and fragile states. Well, guess what? The countries that are most vulnerable to climate change in Africa, 9 out of 10 in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. But in Africa, the countries most vulnerable, 100% of them are these low-income countries, from Niger to Chad to Mali to Burkina Faso, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mauritania, Somalia. All these countries, Guinea, are very, very fragile states. And they depend on the resources that we provide them as grants, for their development. Now, but these are the same countries that face the most nefarious impacts of climate change, and they don't have the resources for it. And they can't even access global climate finance facilities to allow them to be able to, have the financing to actually adapt to climate change. So what we've decided to do is we've created what's called the Climate Action Window, which is a financing window within the African Development Fund. What will it do? We're trying to mobilize $4 billion to $13 billion. That will provide literally grants, because these countries cannot support climate adaptation by borrowing more. Why should they be borrowing? Right. So we want to give them grants to support their ability to be able to adapt and to build resilience. And so, and the point, I guess, is what will it do? What will this facility do? Concretely, for the person that is listening to me, that is in those countries. First, we will provide 20 million people, and those are largely farmers, with weather-indexed insurance products, which means that they can insure themselves against any of this risk of drought, floods, and loss of crops or livestock and so on. The other thing is that we're going to provide 20 million farmers with access to climate-resilient technologies, whether it's drought-tolerant maize or drought-tolerant wheat and so on. We're going to help to regenerate 1 million hectares of degraded land. all across the Sahel in particular. And then we're going to provide access to about 9.6 million people, close to 10 million people, with access to energy in these very low income countries over a 3-year period. So that's why we are raising money now for the African Development Fund's 16th replenishment. Yeah, and we really think that it provides an excellent opportunity for the donor countries to put their money there, because they will actually be providing a platform and resources for these countries that don't have the resources, that are most vulnerable, to be able to adapt to climate change that they did not cause.
But finally, as we leave now, I want to say two things. One, I want to get progress of the Africa Emergency Food Facility, more or less what we're seeing play out, because I remember a few months ago, the commitments were made and I saw that all that action happened at your annual meetings. And more or less, I'd like you to speak to, as we're leaving Rotterdam today, what was that one thing you want everybody to leave here with?
Well, let's take the case of the African Emergency Food Production Facility. Now, this is a facility that we set up to support African countries to cope with another problem, which is the conflict, or which is the war of Russia in Ukraine. And Africa depends so much on Russia and Ukraine for food. You know, Africa depends on wheat from Russia, and also wheat also from Ukraine. And in fact, 31% of all the maize imports in Africa actually comes in from Ukraine, which is kind of mind-boggling. A country that's about 40 million people supplying 31% at 31% of the grain to a continent of 1.4 billion people.
We probably need to know what they're doing right.
No, that doesn't make any sense, quite honestly. And it's one of the things that we're working on. But what we did then is that because Africa will lose this year, it will not be able to import 30 million metric tons of food because of the war, because of the fields that are damaged, because of the transport systems that have been, logistics systems that have been also badly affected. And that will really create a lot of problems for us, which you are seeing already in terms of the rising price of food, in particular wheat, maize, and the inflation that is actually come up, but also the energy prices that have also risen as well. Now, what we decided to do at the bank is we launched a $1.5 billion facility. This $1.5 billion facility is to support African countries to produce 38 million metric tons of food, which is 8 million metric tons more than actually what we are currently going to be losing from actually importing from Russia and Ukraine, for wheat, for maize, for rice, and for soybeans. Total value of that is $12 billion, is how much food we're going to help African countries to do. So to your point of where are we on it? I announced this on the 29th of May, 2022, to tell you how fast we are at the African Development Bank, how seriously we take this issue. In 60 days, our board of directors had approved facilities worth $1.13 billion for 24 African countries. Just think about it. In about 60 days. Now, by the end of this month, our board of directors will have approved up to 35 countries. That's unheard of. That's incredible. And so I am pretty confident that, given the technologies we are giving farmers, that we're not going to have a food crisis in Africa. And just to tell you why, what gives me the confidence is see what we've done in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, we gave them drought, climate resilient wheat varieties with a heat tolerance. Wheat is a temperate crop, but we gave them these varieties that do very well in very hot environments. What happened? We started in 2018. They cultivated these varieties on 5,000 hectares. By 2021, they had increased the cultivated area to 187,000 hectares. By this year, they are gone to 645,000 hectares. As a result, Ethiopia, for the first time in their history, did not import wheat this year. I was talking to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, and he told me, well, look, Akin, next year, we will become a net exporter of wheat. Wow, that's incredible. We did the same for Sudan. Same varieties we give them, heat-tolerant varieties of wheat. In 2 years, they've cut down their wheat import by half. So these are the technologies that I'm talking about that's going to allow Africa to produce more food. But look, we got to move beyond emergency food production to one wherein we unlock the full potential of agriculture in Africa. For me personally, I do not believe Africa should ever go out with bowl in hand begging for food.
We have the land, we have the people, we have the young people.
Yes.
To advantage.
Africa should become the solution for food problems in the world. So it's by making agriculture business, highly productive agriculture, young people, as you rightly said, deploying science and technology and innovations to drive that. We should be the driver of food supply in the world. And that's what we are doing at the African Development Bank. So the issue of the facility was just in the process because we had a shock. But we continue, we are investing up to $25 billion over 10 years to support agriculture in Africa. And as we leave from here, what is my takeaway from here? First and foremost is for you to have African heads of state come here for a meeting, it means that they realize that we need partners. And they actually came here and I was so impressed. It's like, our climate challenge is so big. It's like a baobab tree. In Africa you have a baobab tree, very big. But you need many hands around the tree, okay? So it's like a baobab effort, putting their hands around it, building partnership, building alliances, mobilizing resources for a continent that desperately needs it. So I have the greatest respect and admiration for our heads of state that have been here. But I'm leaving here encouraged because I had commitments from a few countries like Norway in terms of supporting the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. I had commitments announced today by the French government in terms of support to the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. I had commitments that were announced today by Denmark to the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. So that's all exciting for me as we continue to
get more hands around the baobab.
Get more hands around the baobab tree. So hopefully, by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, I hope we will have mobilized enough hands around the baobab tree. We just have to make sure our hands aren't tired right now.
And that was President Akinwumi Adesina of the African Development Bank. Now, after the breakthrough achievements of COP26 in Glasgow, there's a need for Africa to approach COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt with even bolder expectations, especially where there's a tested plan to address the climate crisis in Africa.